Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today's the second in a 5-part design commentary series on competitive StarCraft 2. If you missed the first part, I recommend you watch it before watching this video. For clarity's sake, anytime you hear the word StarCraft, I mean StarCraft 2. If I'm referencing Brood War, I'll just call it Brood War. Finally, I recommend that you watch this video from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. Last time we were playing some 1v1 on the ranked ladder. One of our friends has jumped online, so this time we're going to play some 2v2. This will surprise some folks, but 1v1 was not always the de facto standard for competitive play in real-time strategy games. The World Cyber Games featured 2v2 tournaments for both StarCraft and Age of Empires 2 back in the early 2000s. Some of the most famous games from Age of Empires in particular were team games. In fact, at one point even the developers sponsored a 2v2 tournament. As sacrilegious as it might sound, team games have always been my favorite way of engaging with real-time strategy. It's more social, and the metagame tends to be less figured out than the 1v1 experience. Individual skill is less relevant because your teammates can help you out and compensate for your skill gaps. I was really surprised when I started playing Legacy and discovered that people join teams as a way of finding 1v1 practice partners instead of finding good team games. In 1v1, a trap that's easy to fall into is playing too reactively, seeing everything in terms of what your opponent did or didn't do. This is an intimidating way of thinking about the game because it externalizes your locus of control. Instead of focusing on what you can directly influence, like your mechanics or your plan or your scouting or your game knowledge, you fixate on your opponent. Team games are great because they remind you that competition is best done proactively. For one thing, there are 2 opponents instead of 1, making it pretty hard to overanalyze the other side. For another, you can see everything your partner is doing, and you're spending the whole game talking to them. This is a great opportunity for friendly competition. My friend and I like to compare army values at the end of each game and see who macroed better. This drives you to play better, but in a way that's focused on what you're doing instead of something that's out of your control. I really think folks in the StarCraft community would benefit from playing more team games, especially arranged ones with friends. As of this writing, 270,000 players were ranked on the 1v1 ladder, but only 63,000 teams. Even if we assume that every team is unique, that's less than half the 1v1 population. I think that's a real shame. Anytime I see someone complain that StarCraft is intimidating or frustrating, I wonder whether they've tried making a few good friends and playing some 2v2 or 3v3. It's a genuinely good time, and if you've never tried it, I highly recommend that you do. An interesting thing to note is that my friend and I don't live in the same location. In fact, when I recorded this video, we were on different continents. Despite that physical barrier, we managed to play together with no fuss. StarCraft 2 regionalizes its player base into 5 distinct zones: the Americas, Europe, China, Asia, and Southeast Asia and Australia. I started out on the China server, which actually uses a slightly modified version of StarCraft 2, and whose BattleNet implementation is managed by a third party called NetEase. One of the quirks of the China region is that it forces you to play the game in simplified Chinese. After hundreds of games, I figured out how to work around this, only after which did I discover the Combat Shield upgrade. If you didn't know it's pretty useful for Terran, you should consider researching it. The China region is also unique because your BattleNet account is tied to a real citizen ID, which NetEase verifies with the local police. Since I was a foreigner, I ended up using a friend's. The process is ostensibly for age verification, but the practical result is that nobody really says anything online. You can imagine my amazement when I first played on Asia and Americas and discovered the concept of bad manners. My friend and I are currently playing on North America. StarCraft 2's networking architecture differs from many real-time strategy games in that it makes use of dedicated servers. This is different from a pure peer-to-peer connection. In peer-to-peer, the lag in the game is determined by the lag between the players in the game. With a dedicated server, what matters is your connection to the server, not the other player. This is why professionals prefer to play tournaments in their own region. For example, if a European and an American play against each other on the European region, the European will have relatively lower latency because of geographic proximity to the server. This is why a compromise is often chosen instead. For instance, having Koreans and Europeans play against each other on the American server.
In my day, we mined 8 minerals at a time.
You might have noticed that my friend and I like to play double 3-Racks Reaper. That's a good segue into a discussion of cheeses, gimmicks, and depth and mechanics. Every real-time strategy game eventually faces the accusation of gimmicky design. It's the go-to complaint for players who think a game's design has a problem, but don't understand what it is or how to articulate it. StarCraft 2 is no exception. From the early days of Warpgate to the Mothership Core, all the way to the burrowed infestors of today, It's impossible to read a discussion of this game's design without someone raising the word gimmick. So what is a gimmick? I define it simply as a mechanic that lacks depth. Depth is just a spectrum of outcomes. Depending on individual skill and the current game situation, a deep mechanic has wide variance in its utility. This implies that deep mechanics have an unreachable skill ceiling, enabling players to plumb the depths of their potential for years and years and years. Deep mechanics also stand the test of time because they can be tweaked rather than changed, rounded off and balanced rather than redesigned. This enables the designer to keep the game fresh while not upsetting its balance. One of the strengths of StarCraft's design is its strategic and mechanical depth. Most interactions have so much potential that the game is infinitely enjoyable to play. One of my favorite examples is the Mine Drop opener in TVP, in particular the 6 Marine variation that Beyond liked to employ in late 2016. This opener features a huge amount of strategic and mechanical depth. Let's start with the Terran's decision tree. Beyond opens gas first with a Scouting Reaper and places his second CC before his factory. Like many of Beyond's builds, this is extremely safe. The Reaper is there to catch aggression, gas first enables an early factory, and the second command center still gets placed early. When the factory is complete, he places his starport and starts a Widow Mine. The first Widow Mine is used to defend against a Scouting Adept or an Oracle. The second Widow Mine and 6 Marines go into the first medevac to attack the Protoss. We can already see several strategic choices, all potentially viable depending on the situation. The first Widow Mine can be greedily placed forward in order to catch the Scouting Adept, if the Terran player's game sense and scouting indicate it's not a Stargate opening. Alternatively, the Terran can skip the second Widow Mine, build a Cyclone, or put down a Tech Lab and build a tank if they suspect one base aggression or a pylon rush. The factory gets skipped and usually replaced by a barracks if they see a cannon or zealot rush. The 6 Marines don't have to attack. The Terran can also do a double mine drop and use the Marines to defend at home. The starport can produce a Liberator after the medevac if there are no Phoenixes. If there are, probably another medevac, another add-on, or simply idle for the time being. The timing of the third CC, engineering base, and additional production buildings all vary depending on the game situation. Already the strategic depth is pretty compelling, but it gets even better thanks to this opener's mechanical depth. The 6 Marines and 1 Widow Mine have huge damage dealing potential, but that's all it is, potential. How much they get done depends on the player's ability to control them, in addition to their game sense and scouting of the Protoss base. Effective use of the medevac boost both maximizes the surprise factor of the attack, and employs it early enough to be usable upon exiting. The Widow Mine can be burrowed, unburrowed, and targeted depending on what the Terran wants to attack and when. The Marines should ideally fire in an arc, be pulled back if they're damaged, and, at the highest levels, dropped in and out of the medevac to dodge shots. Finally, this is all highly positional. It needs to consider the placement of enemy pylons and the SimCity of the Protoss base. In the worst case, the Terran makes all the wrong decisions and executes badly. They lose 7 workers to an Oracle and get their medevac killed by a Phoenix. The game is effectively lost. In the best case, the Protoss fails to clean up the drop for minutes on end, the macro behind is pristine, and the game is effectively won. What's beautiful is that both the worst and best cases are rare, and really only happen if a player is severely outplayed or outplaying their opponent. In your average ladder game, the result is different every time. You do slightly better in one game, slightly worse in the next. You learn something about controlling Marines, you tighten up your build. Your opponent makes a 1 in a million mistake and your mine kills 12 probes, and so on and so on. The strategic and mechanical depth of this interaction are what make it fun and enable it to stand the test of time. Players can execute mine drop openers for years and years and years, and still find them enjoyable, still learn a little something. It's a good mix of fresh and familiar. Now, in fairness, I wouldn't go as far as to say that the mine drop opener is the deepest interaction in the game, or anywhere close to that. I use it because I think it's a good, simple, and clean illustration of depth in design. Another way of saying this is that it's the opposite of a gimmick. Let's contrast this with another fairly common interaction in TVP, mid and late game mine drops. While the Terran player distracts the Protoss with an attack somewhere on the map, a boosted medevac drops 2 or 3 mines into a mineral line. The hope is that the Protoss player won't notice the drop and end up losing all of their workers. Many players have complained that this is a gimmicky interaction, and I agree. There's no depth here. Either the Protoss player notices the drop and deflects it, or they don't. Either they lose most of their mineral line, or they don't. Meanwhile, the attack is low risk. It doesn't cost very much, and leverages units that the Terran player was probably building anyway. It's low risk, high reward, and offers few opportunities for interesting counterplay. Like I mentioned last time, it's not straightforward to balance this from a military perspective. The nature of the economy design means that enabling aggressive moves is essential to prevent turtling. In fact, you could almost argue that it's intentionally designed this way to reduce defenders' advantage and create a more action-packed game. It wouldn't be unreasonable to prevent mines from targeting workers. In fact, that's how spider mines worked in Brood War. The fact that widow mines are different is circumstantial evidence that this decision was intentional, though that is not by any means conclusive. What this means is that even when we're able to successfully identify gimmicks, even when we know why they cause pain for players, fixing them is no easy task. It requires an understanding of the larger strategic metagame. Before we go further, let's also discuss mechanics that become more or less gimmicky as time goes on. A trap that's easy to fall into is discussing RTS design in an execution-agnostic way. In other words, failing to consider what would be different if our mechanical skill was 10 times better, or 10 times worse. It's important to label something as gimmicky with respect to its strategic and mechanical potential. Let me go through a couple examples to illustrate. To start, deep mechanics can become gimmicks if players fully exhaust their depth, in other words, maximize their strategic and mechanical potential. The Tankivac is a great example of this. While it was labeled a gimmick right from the start, personally I thought it showed a lot of potential. Strategically, it was used as a core component of numerous timing attacks. It also played an important role in defending early game rushes. Build orders varied bunker, factory, and medevac timings depending on what the player had scouted. Mechanically, pros pushed this mechanic to its limits and kept getting better and better, in particular producing some otherworldly highlight reels of Biotank against Roach Ravager. I still remember watching Innovation use smart casting to pick up a dozen tanks in less than a second. It was incredible. The Tankivac's strong start gave way to a more mixed reception as time went on. The mechanic was very simple, just pick up and drop, putting a relatively low ceiling on its mechanical depth. As pros started to hit this ceiling, their natural reaction was to go further and push the design past its limits. But this isn't necessarily a good thing, and this has been shown in other real-time strategy games as well. When a competitive player hits the ceiling on a mechanic, they continue trying to squeeze power out of it. But rather than going deeper into presumably well-designed interaction, they're in the no man's land of unintended behavior. This leads to craziness in the metagame as players use a mechanic in a way that it wasn't designed for, and sometimes even exploit random bugs and glitches in the engine to get an extra edge. TVZ in particular suffered as players began to effectively exploit the Tankivac. 2-base timing attacks on Frozen Temple were almost pathologically broken as Tankivacs became essentially unkillable. Tankivacs were intended to dodge Ravager shots, not make tanks invulnerable. In addition, the initial interesting and multi-dimensional TVT matchup began to degrade into who dropped their tanks first. Rather than de-emphasizing death balls, the Tankivac was now an integral component of the death ball. By the time this mechanic was removed, even players who used it in every matchup agreed that it had become a problem, though some of them had some second thoughts later on. Personally, I think a tweak would have been a better solution than a removal, but I can understand the logic behind the decision, particularly given the way tanks worked in Brood War. The takeaway is that depth is relative to potential. If players master a mechanic to the point that they have perfected it, the mechanic has lost its depth. Part of keeping a real-time strategy game fresh is identifying these moments and introducing tweaks, if not outright redesigns, to reintroduce depth to the metagame. Otherwise, more and more of the gameplay lives in the realm of unintended behavior, often becoming pathological and unenjoyable. Some folks may be tempted to counter that this worked out just fine for Brood War's metagame, but I want to add 2 caveats to that. One is that Brood War's mechanical depth is near infinite and almost completely lacks diminishing returns. Even serious bugs are side considerations to the primary gameplay. The second is that Brood War's original designers were essentially replaced by tournament organizers, who did in fact ban numerous pathological bugs. You can find a link to a list of these bugs in the description below. While deep mechanics can become gimmicky as their potential is exhausted, gimmicky mechanics can become deep when players discover their potential. The Cyclone comes to mind as a good example. Initially, its design faced heavy criticism, but eventually it became an extremely fun and versatile part of the metagame. Hellion Cyclone into mech, 1 or 2 Cyclones for defense, Cyclone cheeses against Protoss, and so on. It showcased a lot of mechanical depth as players learned how to micro its lock-on ability effectively. I think I speak for a lot of Terran players when I say I'm sad how this unit was changed in patch 3.8. The new Cyclone has plenty of upsides, but honestly I still prefer the old one. Alrighty, I think this is a good place to cut episode 2. If you're feeling confused, my apologies. Partway through editing, I decided to release 10 15-minute episodes instead of 5 30-minute ones. I figured it'd be more watchable, plus you get something new every week. Next time, we'll be discussing cheeses, imperfect information, and mechanics. I hope to see you then. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.